This story is titled, When My Dad Passed, My Sister Blew Through Her Part of the Inheritance on Vacations and a Fancy Stuff. Then she demanded I hand over mine to pay for her husband's medical bills. I refused, so she tried to sue me and my aunt for control of it. And yeah, that shit blew up in her face. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now, let's start the video. I've spent lots of time scrolling through Reddit, reading stories and thinking, that could never happen to me. But now, with everything that's gone down, I feel like my story deserves to be here. It's a mess, here it goes. Growing up, Maddie always acted like she ran the show. She's 27 now, married to this dude Jason, who's basically her arrogance in male form. Meanwhile, I'm 17 and finishing high school, living with Aunt Susan after Dad passed away because Maddie's too busy throwing tantrums to deal with real life. Oh, and Maddie and Aunt Susan? They've never gotten along. They've been enemies since, like, forever. To explain this properly, Maddie's a control freak. She's the kind of person who loves being in control. When we were kids, she'd take over everything. Game night? Maddie had to pick the game. Movie night? It had to be Maddie's favorite movie. And if she didn't get her way, cue the world's most passive-aggressive tantrum. It worked most of the time, except with Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan didn't play Maddie's games, and Maddie hated that. I still remember this one time when we were younger. Dad was sick, and Aunt Susan came over to help out. Maddie was supposed to be doing the dishes, but instead, she was texting Jason and pretending not to hear anyone. Aunt Susan, being Aunt Susan, told Maddie to get off her butt and finish her chores. Maddie rolled her eyes and muttered something like, "You're not my mom." Aunt Susan didn't miss a beat. She said, "No, but I'm not your maid either, so get moving." Maddie did the dishes, but she slammed every plate and cup like she wanted to shatter them all. Afterwards, she ranted to me about how Aunt Susan was always on her case and trying to act like she's in charge. I didn't say anything, but honestly, Aunt Susan was right. Maddie's resentment of Aunt Susan only grew as we got older. Aunt Susan would show up to help Dad with stuff Maddie should have been doing. She'd drive him to doctor's appointments, help with bills, and make sure there was food in the fridge. Maddie called it interfering. She said Aunt Susan was trying to control the family. I called it stepping up. Maddie didn't want to see it that way because it made her look bad. By the time Jason entered the picture, Maddie had perfected her golden child act. Jason worshipped her, and she loved having someone who thought she could do no wrong. Aunt Susan, of course, didn't like Jason from the start. She said he was arrogant and fake, which, spoiler, he was. But Maddie didn't care. She acted like Jason was the best thing that ever happened to her and ignored everyone who disagreed. Jason wasn't just arrogant. He was a full-blown jerk. Every time he came over, he had something snarky to say. If Dad cooked dinner, Jason would make a comment like, "Well, this is interesting." If I mentioned my plans for med school, he'd laugh and say, "Better have a backup plan, kid. Not everyone's cut out for that." Maddie never stood up for me. She just laughed along. Like Jason's rudeness was some kind of joke. Aunt Susan, on the other hand, didn't hold back. She'd shut Jason down with a sharp comment, or just straight up ignore him, which drove him nuts. Maddie's relationship with Aunt Susan got worse after she married Jason. She barely showed up to family gatherings. And when she did, it was only to make some dramatic exit after arguing with Aunt Susan. I remember one Thanksgiving where Maddie started ranting about how some people in the family didn't respect her marriage. Everyone knew she was talking about Aunt Susan, but Aunt Susan just shrugged and said, "Respect is earned, not demanded." Maddie left in a huff, dragging Jason with her, and we didn't hear from her for months. Despite all this, Aunt Susan never stopped being there for me and Dad. She wasn't just an aunt to me, she was like a second parent, especially with how much Maddie was checked out. While Maddie was busy playing house with Jason, Aunt Susan was the one helping me with homework, driving me to school, and teaching me how to cook something other than mac and cheese. She never made me feel like a burden, even when I was struggling with everything going on with Dad. The truth is, Maddie's hatred of Aunt Susan wasn't really about Aunt Susan. It was about Maddie. Aunt Susan saw Maddie for who she really was. Self-centered, manipulative, and not as perfect as she wanted everyone to believe. That scared Maddie because she couldn't control Aunt Susan the way she controlled everyone else. She couldn't charm her, guilt-trip her, or twist her words to make herself look better. And instead of dealing with that, Maddie just labeled Aunt Susan as the enemy. Looking back, it's wild how Maddie could hold on to that grudge for so long. Even after she got married and moved out, she'd still find ways to complain about Aunt Susan. She'd say stuff like, "Why does she always have to be involved?" Or, "I can't stand how she treats me like a kid." Meanwhile, Aunt Susan was the one taking care of everything Maddie couldn't be bothered with, like making sure Dad was okay and keeping the family from falling apart. I didn't realize how bad things would get between them until after Dad passed. That's when Maddie's hatred turned into something else. Something meaner, darker. It wasn't just about not liking Aunt Susan anymore. It was about trying to take her down. And trust me, Maddie wasn't done yet. By the time Dad's health really started to decline, I knew things were about to get tough. He'd been dealing with heart problems for as long as I could remember. But in my junior year, it got so bad he couldn't hide it anymore. He'd get winded walking from the kitchen to the living room, and some days he could barely get out of bed. It killed me to see him like that, because Dad was always the strong one. The guy who'd work late shifts and still find time to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Aunt Susan stepped in right away. She'd always been there for us, but now it was different. She started coming over almost daily, helping with everything from doctor's appointments to making sure Dad actually ate. Maddie, she was nowhere to be found. I tried to keep Maddie updated. I'd text her, call her, leave voicemails. "Dad's not doing great," I'd say. "You should come by and see him." She'd always have an excuse. "Jason's been working late," or "I've got so much going on at work." The one that really pissed me off was, "Let me know if it gets serious." Like, what the hell did she think was happening? Dad was seriously ill, and she couldn't even spare an hour to visit him. I'll never forget the night Dad collapsed in the living room. I was in the kitchen doing homework when I heard a loud thud. I ran in and saw him on the floor, clutching his chest, his face pale and sweaty. I panicked and called 911, then called Aunt Susan. She got there before the ambulance did, her face tight with worry, but calm enough to keep me grounded. "Maddie?" She didn't pick up. I left her a message. "Dad's going to the hospital. You need to come now." That hospital stay was the beginning of the end. Dad was there for weeks, and every day I hoped Maddie would show up. She didn't. Aunt Susan and I were there every day, sitting by his bedside, holding his hand, and trying to keep him comfortable. The nurses knew us by name. Maddie? She didn't even bother to call until the second week, and even then, it wasn't to ask how Dad was doing. It was to complain about how hard her life was with Jason's health issues. Now, here's the thing about Jason. He's got some kind of chronic illness. I don't know much about it because we've never been close, but Maddie liked to bring it up whenever it was convenient for her. "You don't understand how hard it is," she'd say. "Jason's been so sick lately." I get it. Being sick sucks. But she was using it as an excuse to ignore what was happening with Dad. The day Dad passed away, it was just me and Aunt Susan in the room. He'd been in and out of consciousness all day, barely able to speak. I held his hand, and Aunt Susan stroked his hair, telling him it was okay to let go. When he finally stopped breathing, it felt like the whole world stopped. I don't think I've ever cried so hard in my life. Aunt Susan stayed with me the whole time, even as I broke down completely. Maddie didn't even know until hours later. When I finally got through to her, she acted like I was overreacting. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" she said, her voice all fake concern. I wanted to scream. I had been telling her. For weeks. She just didn't care enough to listen. Maddie didn't show up for the funeral either. She said something about Jason not feeling well, and how she couldn't leave him alone. Aunt Susan and I handled everything. Arranging the service, sorting through Dad's stuff, making sure everything was paid for. Maddie didn't lift a finger. She sent some flowers and a generic sympathy card, but that was it. I was furious, but I didn't have the energy to fight her. I was too busy trying to process the fact that my dad was gone. A few days after the funeral, Aunt Susan sat me down to talk about what would happen next. "Your dad left a will," she said. "We'll need to go through it with the lawyer. I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm here for you." I nodded, not really understanding what she meant. At that point, I wasn't even thinking about the will. I was just trying to get through each day without falling apart. When Maddie finally did show up, she acted like nothing had happened. She waltzed into the house like it was just another day, completely ignoring the fact that she'd missed Dad's final moments and his funeral. "So what's going on with the will?" she asked, like it was no big deal. Aunt Susan just gave her a cold look and said, "We'll find out when we meet with the lawyer." It was obvious from the start that Maddie didn't care about anything except the money. She didn't ask about Dad's belongings, his photos, or anything sentimental. She just wanted to know how much she was getting. It made me sick. Aunt Susan, on the other hand, was focused on making sure everything was done the way Dad wanted. She knew how much Dad wanted me to go to med school, and she wasn't going to let Maddie ruin that. By the time we sat down with the lawyer, I was bracing myself for the worst. Maddie had already made it clear that she didn't think Aunt Susan had any right to be involved, but Dad's will said otherwise. Maddie and I were each getting half of the inheritance, but since I wasn't 18 yet, Aunt Susan was named custodian of my share. Maddie's face when she heard that, pure rage. She didn't say anything right then, but I could tell she was fuming. After the meeting, Maddie pulled me aside. "You know Aunt Susan doesn't really understand us, right?" she said, her voice all sweet and fake. "She's always been kind of cold, but we're family, and family should stick together. If you ever need help with the inheritance, just let me know." I didn't say anything, but I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to get me on her side because she couldn't stand that Aunt Susan was in charge. Aunt Susan wasn't having any of it. Later that day, she sat me down and said, "I know Maddie's going to try to manipulate you. Don't let her. This money is for your future, and your dad trusted me to protect it. I'm not going to let her take that away from you." I didn't fully understand what Aunt Susan meant at the time, but I trusted her. And thank God I did, because Maddie was about to turn this whole thing into a nightmare. The day we met with the lawyer to go over Dad's will was one of the most awkward days of my life. It wasn't just the sadness of losing Dad. It was knowing that Maddie was going to turn the whole thing into a circus. She strolled into the lawyer's office like she owned the place, dressed in some expensive-looking outfit that screamed, "Look at me," and didn't even bother saying hello to Aunt Susan. She just glanced at me and went, "So, what's the deal? How's this gonna work?" The lawyer, Mr. Carter, was an older guy with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He seemed like the type who'd seen it all, which was good because Maddie wasn't exactly subtle about her intentions. He started by going through some legal stuff, but all Maddie cared about was the money. She interrupted him halfway through to ask, "Can you just skip to the part where we find out what we're getting?" Aunt Susan gave her a look that could have frozen lava, but Mr. Carter just nodded and kept it professional. "Your father's estate will be divided equally between the two of you," he said, 50% to each of you. However, since Ethan is still a minor, their share will be managed by Ms. Susan, as designated in the will, until they turn 18. I swear, you could have heard a pin drop. Maddie's smile froze on her face, and for a second, she just stared at him like she couldn't believe what she'd heard. Then, in the fakest voice possible, she said, "Oh, that makes sense. Of course Aunt Susan would be in charge. She's always so responsible." I almost laughed because Maddie couldn't have sounded less genuine if she tried. Aunt Susan didn't say anything, but I could tell she was ready for whatever nonsense Maddie was about to pull. After the meeting, Maddie cornered me in the parking lot. "Hey, just so you know," she said, leaning in like she was about to share some big secret, "you don't have to listen to Aunt Susan about everything. I mean, she's great and all, but we're siblings. We should be making these decisions together." I just nodded, not wanting to start a fight right there. But inside, I was fuming. Maddie had spent years bad-mouthing Aunt Susan, calling her controlling and overbearing, and now she was trying to act like they were best friends? It was so transparent. It was almost pathetic. Aunt Susan must have seen the look on my face when I got into her car because as soon as we pulled out of the parking lot, she asked, "What did she say to you?" "Just the usual," I said. "She thinks we should be making decisions together." Aunt Susan sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I knew this was coming. Maddie's never been one to let something like this go. "Listen to me, Ethan. Your father trusted me to manage this money for a reason. He wanted you to have a future, to go to med school, to have the life he dreamed of for you. Don't let her guilt you into giving that up." I nodded. She was too stubborn to let something like this go without a fight. It didn't take long for Maddie to show her true colors. Over the next few weeks, she started showing up at Aunt Susan's house more often than she ever had before. This was the same Maddie who used to avoid family events if Aunt Susan was going to be there. And now she was dropping by unannounced like it was the most natural thing in the world. She'd bring pastries or flowers, acting all sweet and charming, but it was so fake it made my skin crawl. "Family is so important," she said one day while sitting in Aunt Susan's living room, sipping tea like she actually cared about anything other than herself. "We've all been through so much, and I just think we need to stick together, you know?" Aunt Susan wasn't buying it. "What do you need, Maddie?" she asked bluntly. Maddie blinked, her fake smile slipping for just a second before she recovered. "Nothing. Just wanted to check in, see how you two are doing. Is that so bad?" Aunt Susan didn't respond, and the silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Eventually, Maddie stopped pretending and got straight to the point. One afternoon, she showed up at Aunt Susan's house with tears in her eyes and a sob story about Jason's health. Apparently, his chronic illness had taken a turn for the worse, and he needed surgery. Expensive surgery that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death, Maddie said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But we're desperate. Jason's been so sick and I don't know what else to do. She turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading. Please, Ethan. Just a small portion of your inheritance. It would mean everything to us. I froze. I didn't know what to say. Jason's health was serious, sure, but this was my inheritance. My future. I'd been saving it for med school, for the life Dad wanted me to have. Giving it to Maddie would mean throwing all of that away. Aunt Susan stepped in before I could respond. That money is for Ethan, Maddie, she said firmly. It's not for you, and it's not for Jason. Your father made that very clear in his will. Maddie's face twisted, her fake sweetness disappearing in an instant. You've always hated me, she snapped. You've been against me since we were kids. This isn't about Dad's wishes. It's about you trying to control everything like you always do. Aunt Susan didn't even flinch. Believe whatever you want, Maddie, she said calmly. But that money isn't going anywhere. Maddie stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I thought that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. Maddie wasn't done, not by a long shot. I thought Maddie storming out of Aunt Susan's house would be the last I'd hear from her for a while, but I was wrong. Maddie doesn't give up easily, especially when she thinks she's been wronged. The thing about Maddie is, she can't stand not being in control. It eats away at her, and when she doesn't get her way, she goes all in, turning up the drama to maximum volume. What I didn't expect was how far she'd take things. It started small, like it always does with Maddie. She sent me a couple of texts the day after she left Aunt Susan's, acting all calm and reasonable. Hey, I know things got heated yesterday, she wrote. I just want you to think about what I said. Jason's surgery isn't optional, it's life or death. We're family, and I know Dad would want you to help. I ignored it at first. I didn't want to engage because I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere good. But Maddie doesn't take silence as an answer. The next day, she showed up at Aunt Susan's house again, unannounced. I was in my room when I heard the doorbell, followed by Maddie's overly loud, overly sweet voice. I want to talk with Ethan, Maddie said, trying to sound innocent. It's important. Whatever you have to say, you can say it from the porch, Aunt Susan replied. I peeked through my window and saw Maddie standing there, holding a folder like she was about to make some big presentation. Fine, she huffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. I brought some information about Jason's condition. I thought maybe if you both understood how serious this is, you'd reconsider. Aunt Susan didn't say anything, just crossed her arms and waited. Maddie took that as her cue to start her pitch. Jason has been dealing with this for years, she began, pulling papers out of her folder and holding them up like they were some kind of evidence. But now it's gotten to the point where he can't function without surgery. The doctors say it's critical. She went on for a while, detailing how expensive the procedure was and how their insurance wouldn't cover everything. We've already put our savings into this, she said, her voice trembling. But it's not enough. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for help. Just a small portion of the inheritance. It's sitting there unused, and Jason doesn't have time to wait. Aunt Susan didn't budge. Maddie, I understand that this is hard for you, but your father left that money for Ethan. It's not up for discussion. Maddie's face changed instantly. The fake sadness disappeared, replaced by pure anger. You're unbelievable, she snapped. How can you stand there and act like this is about Dad's wishes? You've always hated me. You're just using this as an excuse to punish me. That's enough, Aunt Susan said, her voice icy. You can leave now. Maddie didn't argue. She stormed off, slamming the gate behind her. But I knew this wasn't over. A few days later, Maddie tried a different approach. She started texting me directly, skipping Aunt Susan altogether. At first, it was more guilt-tripping. I can't believe you're letting Aunt Susan control your decisions like this, one message read. You're old enough to think for yourself. When that didn't work, she switched tactics. You know Jason has always supported you, right? She wrote. He was the one who said you could totally get into med school. He believes in you. I can't believe you're turning your back on him now. That one made me laugh out loud. Jason, the guy who mocked me for wanting to be a doctor, suddenly believes in me? Yeah, right. I didn't bother responding, but Maddie didn't stop. The messages kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. Then came the photo. It was a picture of Jason lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to a monitor. Maddie captioned it, "This is what you're ignoring. This is what you're letting happen." I showed it to Aunt Susan, who just shook her head. She's trying to manipulate you, she said. Don't fall for it. When the text didn't work, Maddie escalated. One evening, Aunt Susan got a call from someone she hadn't spoken to in years. Our cousin Lauren. Maddie had apparently reached out to her and spun some sob story about how Aunt Susan was hoarding my inheritance and refusing to help a dying man. Lauren called to get Aunt Susan's side of the story, and when Aunt Susan explained what was really happening, Lauren was furious. She tried to make me feel guilty for not stepping in to help, she said. What's wrong with her? It wasn't just Lauren. Over the next week, Maddie reached out to other family members, trying to rally them against Aunt Susan. She framed it like Aunt Susan was some kind of villain, keeping me under her thumb and refusing to help Jason out of spite. Most people saw through her, but a few bought into it, calling Aunt Susan to express their concern. I couldn't believe how far Maddie was willing to go. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about winning. She wanted to break Aunt Susan, to make her cave and give in just so Maddie could feel like she was in control. The breaking point came when Maddie showed up at Aunt Susan's house with a lawyer. She didn't warn us, didn't call ahead. She just showed up, demanding to talk. Aunt Susan answered the door but refused to let Maddie inside. What do you want now? She asked, exasperated. Maddie gestured to the lawyer beside her. I'm filing a legal petition, she said, her tone smug. You've been manipulating Ethan and mishandling the inheritance. I'm asking the court to remove you as custodian and appoint me instead. Aunt Susan didn't even blink. Good luck with that, she said, slamming the door in Maddie's face. After that, it was official. Maddie wasn't just trying to guilt me into giving her the money, she was trying to take it by force. The court date was set, and Aunt Susan and I started preparing with our lawyer, Mr. Carter. Maddie thought she had the upper hand, but she didn't realize how much evidence we had against her. She'd picked the wrong fight, and she was about to find out the hard way. When the court date was set, it felt like the calm before a storm. Maddie's legal petition accused Aunt Susan of manipulating me, mishandling the inheritance, and trying to control my life for her own benefit. It was all complete nonsense, but Maddie was banking on being able to spin her story well enough to convince the court. If she succeeded, the court would appoint her as my guardian, giving her control of the inheritance until I turned 18. She wasn't asking for part of the money. She wanted all of it. Aunt Susan wasn't rattled. She'd been through enough of Maddie's games over the years to know how to stay calm under pressure. We worked closely with Mr. Carter, our lawyer, gathering every piece of evidence we could to show the truth about Maddie's motives. Maddie arrived at court with her lawyer and Jason in tow. He looked out of place, sitting in the back of the courtroom with a scowl on his face like he'd rather be anywhere else. Maddie, on the other hand, was in her element. She walked in like she was the hero of some dramatic story, all fake confidence and exaggerated concern. Her lawyer started by painting her as the caring sister, someone who only wanted what was best for me. My client's sole intention is to protect her brother, the lawyer said. She is deeply concerned about the influence Miss Susan has over him, and believes that the inheritance is not being managed in his best interest. I could feel my blood boiling as I listened. Maddie hadn't cared about me or Dad for years, and now she was pretending to be my savior? Aunt Susan must have noticed my clenched fists, because she gave me a small nudge, silently telling me to stay calm. When it was our turn, Mr. Carter dismantled Maddie's argument piece by piece. He started with the bank records, which clearly showed that Aunt Susan hadn't touched a single cent of my inheritance. The funds are being held in a custodial account, as outlined in the will, Mr. Carter explained. There is no evidence of mismanagement or improper influence. Then came the part that completely flipped the narrative: Maddie's financial records. Mr. Carter had filed a request for them as part of the case, and the results were exactly what we expected. Maddie had blown through her half of the inheritance in just 6 months. There were charges for a brand new SUV, high-end kitchen appliances, luxury vacations, and countless other unnecessary expenses. It painted a clear picture of someone who was financially irresponsible and desperate. Finally, Mr. Carter presented the text messages and voicemails Maddie had sent me over the past few weeks. The court listened as her voice echoed through the room, pleading, demanding, and even threatening. "You're sitting on all this money while my husband is dying," one voicemail said. "If you don't help, you're going to regret it." The judge's expression hardened as the evidence piled up. Maddie squirmed in her seat, her confidence slipping with every passing minute. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and took a deep breath. This was my chance to tell the truth, and I wasn't going to waste it. "Your Honor," I began, "this case isn't about protecting me or my inheritance. It's about my sister refusing to take responsibility for her own choices. Maddie received the exact same inheritance I did, half of everything my dad worked his whole life to leave us. She spent her share on luxury items and vacations, and now she's trying to take what's left of mine to fix her mistakes." I glanced over at Maddie, who was glaring at me with a mix of anger and disbelief, but I didn't stop. Over the past few weeks, Maddie has harassed me with messages, tried to guilt me into giving her money, and even involved other family members in an attempt to pressure me. She's not here to protect me. She's here because she wants control. My aunt, on the other hand, has done nothing but support me. She's been there every step of the way, making sure I stay on track for med school and honoring my dad's wishes. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't even be here today. I sat down, my hands shaking slightly, but I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I'd said everything I needed to say, and there was no taking it back. When Maddie got her chance to respond, she doubled down on her sob story. "I've always cared about my brother," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I just want what's best for him. Jason's surgery is life or death, and I thought this family could come together to help. I didn't expect this kind of hostility. It was all so fake it made my skin crawl." Maddie had spent years treating Aunt Susan like an enemy, and now she was trying to frame herself as the victim. But the evidence was stacked against her, and it was clear the judge wasn't buying it. After reviewing everything, the judge delivered the verdict. The evidence clearly shows that Ms. Susan has acted responsibly in her role as custodian of the inheritance. Furthermore, the petitioner's financial history and personal communications reveal a motive that is self-serving, rather than protective of the respondent's interests. The petition is dismissed. Maddie's face turned bright red. Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought she might break a tooth. But the judge wasn't done. This court will also investigate whether the petitioner's claims and submitted evidence constitute perjury or fraud. If found guilty, there will be consequences. After reviewing, she was found guilty of filing false claims and trying to commit fraud, and the consequences hit her hard. They fined her for wasting court resources, ordered her to go to counseling to deal with her manipulative behavior, and slapped her with a restraining order to keep her away from me and my aunt. I could barely contain my relief. Aunt Susan gave my shoulder a small squeeze, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As we left the courtroom, Maddie tried to catch up to us, but Aunt Susan shut her down with a single look. "We're done here," she said firmly. Maddie stopped in her tracks, her hands balled into fists, but she didn't say anything. She knew she'd lost. Jason stayed silent the whole time, probably realizing there was no way to talk his way out of this mess. The two of them left together, Maddie muttering angrily under her breath, but I didn't care what she had to say anymore. The fight was over, and we'd won. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I finally had control of my life again. Aunt Susan and I had stood our ground, and Maddie's schemes had backfired spectacularly. She thought she could manipulate me and everyone else to get what she wanted, but in the end, she'd only exposed herself for who she really was. And now, she couldn't touch me, or my future.